Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. I feel like I haven't done this in a while, but I think I have. It's just I've been like kind of maybe getting into TikTok, which as a 25-year-old I feel like is just not what I'm supposed to be doing, but apparently that's what I'm doing now. My username is Actual Spinster, like it is here, if you're interested in following me. Who knows if I'll keep going. I've made a couple and it's kind of satisfying and fun. So this video is about what I read in June. I didn't read like that many books, but I read quite a few like longer books, and also I think I gave like a lot of things 5 stars this month. Let's just get into what I read. So I first of all read The Sorcerer to the Crown by Zencho, which is set in Regency era London, and it follows Zacharias' wife, who is the first like black sorcerer royal, and there's this whole kind of like hierarchical setup of like wizards basically, or like thaumaturges and like magicians and sorcerers and stuff. And it's also kind of in, so not only are there like the racial politics about Zacharias being like the first black sorcerer royal, and like he experiences like a lot of racism, and also like his kind of like mentor, because he was basically like this sort of protege when he was a kid, is this like white man who was the sorcerer royal before him, but like he had some beliefs, did some things that were like really not good, and like, you know, like slavery does exist in this story, and so like Zacharias's like experience of like family is like violated by that basically. And then the other character that this book follows is called Prunella, and she's like, I think she's like 19 or so, and she is this girl, and like in the society that this is set in, like women, if they do have magic, and especially if they're like upper class women, they're not supposed to, they need to like suppress their magic because it's not like the done thing, and it's okay to have like a chef or like a cook who like uses a little bit of magic to make sure like her soups don't burn or something, but like if you're like a lady then you're not supposed to. And so Prunella is at this like finishing school. She's also like kind of an orphan, and like she doesn't really know like her family, she doesn't know who her mother is. Yeah, and so it's just kind of like about them and their experiences and like how they come to meet, and I think it's fun. It's like written in you know, it's like trying to be a book that was written during the Regency era. It's quite fast-paced in some places, and I think like the character development doesn't necessarily all happen, but I still enjoyed it. I'm excited to read the second book. I think I'll probably like that even more. Zacharias and Prunella did just like make me happy, so that was nice and sort of unexpected. The next thing I read was Mr. Fortune's Maggot by Sylvia Warner. So this book is about a reverend called Timothy Fortune, and he goes to an island called Fanua, and like he goes to convert people, you know, he's a missionary, and it's about that. And it's also kind of, I guess, centered on this one relationship he has with this like one particular boy who he meets there called Llewellyn. I mean, as you can tell from like how I described that, so this was like written in the 1920s as well, maybe that's important context too, but like it's pretty rough in terms of colonization, representing a missionary, a missionizing colonial logic about people of colour and faith. And I think like Sylvia Warner is not pro-colonization, and I do feel a little bit as I did when I read A Passage to India, where everybody is kind of like applauding that book for being anti-colonial and like amazingly good and like against imperialism, but it still reproduces particular kinds of representation and particular kind of colonial logic about like colonized people and colonization too, and just like in general. And although it isn't as like pro colonialism as colonizers are, like it doesn't actually mean it's like anti those things or sufficiently anti those things. Like this is a comedic novel, but like I'm not entirely sure who the butt of the joke is, slash I think the butt of the joke is too often both people in the scenarios that this book puts forth, rather than just on Mr. Fortune. So like I didn't really enjoy reading this. Also like something that frustrated me, which I only realised afterwards because I looked at the bag, is that the cover on this book is by Paul Gauguin, and he's infamously this like disgustingly racist and violent, you know, like misogynistic and enactor of racialized misogyny, and like did really disgusting stuff, and all of his work is tainted by that. Like it's not, you can't just separate it out. And I feel like not only does the fact that they used the cover on this book kind of demonstrate that like its politics are not where people think it is, I also just think it's like really gross, and I wish I could take back that I said it was a nice cover now. I'm reading Sylvia Warner because I'm trying to learn more about her and her work, which does include her flaws and her uncomfortable parts, so this doesn't make me stop like wanting to do my project or read her, because like I kind of expected that there would be some things like this going in. but it's not good, it's not fun, and I really definitely wouldn't recommend this book. The next book I read though was really good, and that's Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid, and I kind of don't really want to tell you very much about it, but it's basically just like about this teenage girl from the West Indies who comes to North America and works as a like au pair for a couple called Lewis and Mariah, and they have 4 children. I think they're all girls, and it's just kind of like about her and like the relationships she develops, specifically with Mariah and also with her children, and then also the relationship she has with herself and with her own mother, with the people that she, you know, moved away from, and it's just kind of about her like figuring out herself, her sexuality. But I really enjoyed like the way that this talks about sexuality, and also like Lucy is quite gross, and I kind of like that. I'm not sure what she would think of me. I think she probably wouldn't like me, and I kind of like being introduced to characters like that. It's quite like affronting, but like in a nice way. Yeah, I don't know, I also kind of want to give her a hug sometimes. I also feel like Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, is like haunting me for these reads, because this painting on this cover was fucking done by him as well. But yeah, I would really recommend it, notwithstanding the cover. It's written in this like very kind of clear and concise, but also I would say like somewhat lyrical way. The ending I loved, and I really enjoyed like this kind of like difficult and complicated exploration of like mother-daughter bonds or relationships, and then also kind of like the relationships between women, and also between women who have different experiences of like power and privilege and race and sort of like structural like care. So yeah, definitely would recommend. I read it pretty quickly too, and that was nice. And I think I said this already in my mid-year book freak out tag. Oh, I'm really hot. But like I am looking forward to reading more Jamaica Kincaid. Like I'm excited to check more of her work out, so I will be on the lookout for it. The next book was also a 5-star book for me, and I just enjoyed it so much. It feels like a very long time ago I read it actually, but this is Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, which has been going around on BookTube and like queer book spaces for a while. It's a very like sapphic, kind of like horror-y type book. It has kind of like threads of like literary fiction and horror books, and then also historical fiction, all kind of melded into one in this sort of like interwoven tale across time. And it has sort of like 2 main storylines. One is set in 1902, which is where this boarding school where this like death of 2 girls, Flo and Clara, happened thanks to some wasps, and then you know that storyline kind of follows the consequences and like ricochets of their deaths, and also their love for each other and how that affects like the school and the people left there and the principal. And then also there's a modern day storyline as well, which is about mostly like 3 all like queer women. I think 2 of them are lesbians and Audrey is bisexual, and 2 of them are actors or actresses, whatever, and one of them is called Merritt, and she wrote a book about Brookhaunts, which is the school where the murder happened, and they are brought together by making this film, which is like a horror film, but it's like a retelling of the story of Flo and Clara. This is a book that like I gave 5 stars to. I enjoyed it a lot. I wouldn't say it is like a perfect book. I felt kind of similarly to how I felt with The Priory of the Orange Tree, where like I just enjoyed the process of reading it. I enjoyed bringing it with me and reading parts of it. I actually listened to the audiobook alongside reading it, so I would also kind of like read bits, like read ahead of the audiobook, and then I would like re-listen to them via audio, or I would listen on the audiobook and then go back and read them like physically, and I just really enjoyed doing that. It made me feel like the story was even more kind of like alive and present with me, and also I got to like reread like scenes I really liked over and over again, and I actually read like the first kind of chapter, which I think was really well done, like 3 or 4 times. I did, you know, prefer the 1902 storyline, which like I expected myself to do that because obviously, but after I got kind of like used to the fact that like in the modern day storyline they talk about like Instagram and stuff like that, I find that kind of like somewhat unbearable, / I don't really want to read about it. But after I got over that kind of like immediate kind of cringe, I guess, I got into it and like I enjoyed it a lot. I don't necessarily think like the ending was particularly carried through, but I still really enjoyed it. The characters in the 1902 like timeline, and to some degree the modern day one, get obsessed with a book by Mary MacLane called I Await the Devil's Coming, which is like her diary, which was released in 1900, 1902, 1901, and you know, it was big because she's like this like angsty, grumpy, bisexual teen in it, and she falls in love with somebody called the Anemone Woman, and that she calls the Anemone Woman. Anyway, and And so there's also kind of that running through it. So it's a very like intertextual text. It references like Truman Capote as well and stuff like that. And also quite a lot of horror films, I would presume. I'm not like a horror book reader or a horror book or a horror film watcher, but like I enjoyed this a lot. I also like how it's kind of like just one elaborate pun. Anyway, that's that. Love a chunky book and happy to have finally read it and to have loved it. Next, I read another Sylvia Townsend Warner, which was supposed to be my July choice for the Summer with Sylvia summer reading challenge that I'm doing. But I decided to read it this month, partially because like Mr. Fortune's Maggot left like such a bad taste in my mouth. So I was like, I'm going to read this other one. And then I also have realised that like I should just really reread Lolly Willows, so I was like, well, I'll just read as many as possible. I think I will be reading Summer Will Show in July, in case you're interested. So yeah, the next Sylvia Townsend Warner I read was The True Heart. So I read the preface before I started reading it. I read the preface in Mr. Fortune's Maggot as well, and that was like my favourite part of the book. Which is I think why I did it here, but the preface kind of does ruin, like to some degree, the story. It's not very long, but I think I will describe it in a way that it was described in the preface. So I guess if you don't want to know like anything, then skip forward. But I also think that this will make people want to read it more, because this is basically like a retelling of the Psyche and Cupid myth, and it follows a 16-year-old girl who's an orphan called Suki Bond. Suki as in Psyche, which like I kind of like that. And she, you know, finishes at this like orphanage where she was brought up and is sent to New Easter Farm and becomes like a farmhand, like a farm worker, and there she meets a boy called Eric. The story I don't think you can like track directly completely onto the myth, but I also think that it was done in quite like an innovative and interesting way. Like I read, you know, after I had finished reading this, I read some like encyclopedia entries about like the myth, because I had kind of forgotten, you know, like I kind of had the basics kind of, but like had sort of forgotten anyway. And so that was really interesting to then like read the thing and then try to like track which parts onto what, and that's what, you know, if you're interested in doing that, then I would read the preface, but maybe after you've read the book. I liked how it's written. I mean, that is one thing that I feel like I know I'm going to enjoy about a Sylvia Townsend Warner book, is that it's going to be written really like well and beautifully, and I love the cover of this too. It was definitely better than Mr. Fortune's Maggot, but you know, it wasn't like my favourite. I do feel that like it is interesting to read queer, you know, like these like lesbian dykey women writers write kind of like heterosexual love stories, because I do feel like they do them in quite like a queer and dyke way. I think that the one thing that I found interesting is that Eric is like disabled, and he isn't described in the particularly nice terms, but like he is Suki's love interest, and I quite enjoyed that. Like there was like a dynamic to the story that I didn't kind of expect, and I did like it in the end. I think it's nice that like, I don't know, I guess it's just nice that like disabled people are attractive to people, because they are. Anyway, very much looking forward to Summer Will Show, because I do actually think I'm gonna like enjoy it, not just like find it fine. The next book I read was a book by May Sinclair, and I actually picked it up because I went to a May Sinclair conference, like just on Zoom. The conference was interesting in some parts, but it also kind of made me think that like maybe she would be a good author to check out in terms of the era that I'm interested in, and for like developing some of my ideas or whatever. So yeah, I picked up this copy. She's pretty hard to find, because I'm pretty sure she does have some like Virago editions, but I don't think they're up to date. Like I don't think she's being published by them currently, but you can find some of those. And then the British Library women writers, sort of, they have like a collection of early 20th century women writers that they're publishing / republishing, and she is one of them. I think she was the first, and this is The Tree of Heaven, which was published in 1917, and I do think that it's kind of interesting and funny and a bit frustrating for her to be included in this run and be like represented in this very particular way, you know, like it's very stylized and kind of like feminine, and like, you know, there's all of these flowers. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but I do feel like it does the book itself a disservice, or like it doesn't really speak to what this book is like to read, which is actually quite uncomfortable and very sad, and you know, also kind of creepy and weird. She's obsessed with ghosts. I mean, 1917 is during the First World War, so like you can kind of imagine like the vibe of this, if not necessarily like exactly what happens. It follows a family, and it starts with Frances and Anthony. They have 4 children. Their newest baby is called John, Then they have Nikki or Nicholas, Michael and Dorothy or Dorothea, and it's just about them growing up. And it starts, I guess, must be kind of like 1890s or like late 1880s or something, and it just follows them through their lives. And I kind of loved it. Not only did I find it interesting from like my particular standpoint, and like also some of my politics, I guess, was kind of interesting to read about in here. Like Dorothea is a really interesting character because she's kind of like, she's like in the suffrage struggle, but at the same time she's like kind of outside of it. And she also talks about like the abolition of marriage and stuff like that, which I think is pretty radical in the context of like other suffrage fiction that I've read. And then it does follow into the First World War. And yeah, I just like love them. It made me cry like a lot, was surprising to me. And I just ended up like loving Michael and Nikki as well. And there's also a conversation going on about art in the face of violence, in the face of war, in the face of trauma, and also a discussion about modernism specifically, which is very interesting because Michael is like a poet, and so he's having these like very explicit conversations in the text about that. There's a lot about family. I mean, it's called the Tree of Heaven. There's like a disagreement about whether the Tree of Heaven in the garden is actually an ash tree or not. And also Anthony, the father, he is like a timber business person, so he like supplies the government with wood and is, you know, yeah, like his business is all about trees. And of course, you know, that makes you think about family trees, but then also like what a family tree can represent, which is this like this closeness, this sharedness, this interlockingness, but also this like kind of violence. And trees of heaven are actually quite bad for the plants and things around them. So yeah, very interesting for me to read as this like 21st century family abolitionist and communist lesbian, you know, definitely not like politically on the same level, but there are definitely glimpses and kind of like ambivalences in here which I think were really interesting. And I just ordered like an old like Virago edition of Mary Olivia, which is another of her books, and then I would like to read another one. She did write quite a lot. Okay, I'm almost done. I'm sorry, I feel like I've talked forever and ever. Then the last book I read was The Tenant of Wildfire Hall by Anne Bronte. Very happy to have finally read this. This is another book that I loved, and yeah, it's been one of the books that I have really wanted to read from the Victorian period like for a long time. And that's partially because like I've read one other Anne Bronte before and that was fine, but I've also seen like a lot of people kind of talk about this specific Anne Bronte novel as a kind of like proto-feminist classic in a way that is like quite distinct from her sister's work, and also just like generally as kind of like a almost kind of groundbreaking book. It covers a lot of ground. It talks about women, but something that I liked about it is the way that it talks about children, and also the way that there's like this interconnected sense of, in a way, like solidarity between women and children, because the way that women are treated is often predicated on the oppression of children / vice versa. You know, there's like this very interconnected patriarchal violence that happens, and I like the exploration of that in the context of Victorian times. I think like it's quite an intense book to read, and it is about, I mean, ultimately sort of domestic violence and alcoholism, which is quite hard to read. But yeah, I also liked it. I think it's also manages to be like tender as well as sad. So basically the story is told in two parts, and one thing I also liked is the way that this is self-conscious about it being a narrative, and about it being a women's narrative too, question mark. But basically the conceit is that like we begin by reading the letter that this guy called Gilbert is writing to some friend of his, I can't remember, and it all kind of kicks off with a widow called Mrs. Graham moving into this like fairly, I don't know, shabby, that's not the right word, I can't think of it, but anyway, place called Wildfire Hall nearby where he lives, and just kind of like about their interactions. And then I guess like a third of the way through the novel we get to read directly from Helen's diary about her life and her experiences, and that was, yeah, I felt like there was like this really interesting self-consciousness about like self-fashioning yourself as an author, as a woman. I think it's doing clever and interesting things. I think it's just very interesting, and I did enjoy it as well, and I thought it was nice. It was good, they said. But yeah, I'm excited as well to like reread it. I think there will be more that kind of shows itself to me as I reread it. Anyway, so that is everything that I read this month. I feel like I read more last month, but I managed to talk much quicker. Let me know your thoughts on the books that I read, or if you've read them and what you think of them, or if you have any like recommendations of books to read that sound similar to these books that I have read. That would be really cool. I'd like that. Yeah, and I will leave my TikTok in the description box as well. And I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye.